The coffee in Sarah Mitchell's thermos had gone cold an hour ago, but she kept sipping it anyway, the bitter taste somehow fitting for a Tuesday afternoon that had started like every other day for the past 16 years. She'd arrived at Riverside Medical Center at 6:45 a.m., parked in the same spot she always did, space 47, third row, and clocked in at 7:00 a.m. sharp. In 16 years, she'd never been late. Not once. Not when her daughter was sick. Not when she'd had the flu herself. Not when a blizzard shut down half the state. Reliability wasn't just a trait Sarah possessed. It was the foundation of her identity. The emergency department had been relatively calm that morning. A few minor injuries, a diabetic patient having complications, an elderly man with chest pains who turned out to be fine after tests. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that required Sarah's 16 years of expertise and intuition. She'd spent her shift doing what she always did, mentoring younger nurses, checking in on patients, ensuring protocols were followed, and solving problems before they became disasters. Around noon, she'd helped a newly hired RN named Marcus understand the proper way to establish communication between departments during complicated cases. He'd thanked her profusely. "You're the best at this," he'd said with genuine gratitude. That compliment now felt like a cruel joke. At 2:15 p.m., Sarah's supervisor, Linda Chen, had appeared at her station with an expression that immediately made Sarah's stomach tighten. She knew that look. She'd seen it on families' faces when doctors delivered bad news. "Sarah, can you come to Administrator Briggs' office? Right now." Linda hadn't made eye contact. Sarah had followed her through the sterile hallways, past the waiting rooms filled with worried people, through the administrative corridor where the carpet changed from tile to plush and the air seemed to carry the weight of decision-making. Her mind had raced through possibilities. Had she made a mistake? Was a patient suing? Had someone complained about her? But she'd reviewed her performance evaluations in her mind, perfect marks for 16 consecutive years. No complaints, no incidents, nothing but commendations. The office of Administrator Richard Briggs was exactly what you'd expect from a hospital executive. Mahogany desk, degrees on the wall, a window overlooking the parking lot where she'd been walking toward for the last decade and a half. Briggs was a newer addition to the hospital, brought in 6 months ago as part of a corporate restructuring initiative. He was in his 50s, wearing a pressed suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly mortgage payment. There was a document on his desk, a folder with her name on it. He didn't invite her to sit. That was the first sign of how this would go. "Sarah, thank you for coming in," Briggs had said, speaking in the measured tone of someone who delivered this same speech many times before. "I'm sure you're wondering why I called you in. The hospital has been conducting a comprehensive operational analysis, and we've made some difficult decisions regarding departmental staffing." He paused, opening the folder. "Your position, head nurse of the emergency department, has been identified as redundant given our new operational model. Effective immediately, you're being terminated." The words had landed like physical blows. Redundant, effective immediately, terminated. Not let go, not laid off, terminated. Like she was a contract, not a person. Like she was data to be deleted from a spreadsheet. Sarah had stood there, paralyzed. She'd wanted to speak, to defend herself, to ask how this was possible, but the sheer randomness of it, the arbitrariness, had stolen her voice. Briggs continued talking, his words becoming a blur of corporate jargon. Outsourcing of nursing positions to independent staffing agencies. Cost optimization strategies. Severance package details. Your health insurance continues for 30 days. He slid a document across his desk. "These are your termination papers. We'll need you to sign them before you leave the building." "Can I ask why?" Sarah had finally found her voice, and it sounded small, almost desperate. "The decision is final," Briggs had said, not really answering her question. "Our analysis shows that we can contract nursing services more cost-effectively through third-party providers. It's nothing personal. It's just business strategy." Nothing personal, just business. As if 16 years of her life of sacrifices, of being there at 3 a.m. when the hospital was short-staffed, and she came in anyway, of holding patients' hands during their worst moments, of training nurses who would go on to save countless lives, as if all of that meant nothing, as if she were interchangeable with some algorithm. Linda had escorted her to her locker. Sarah's hands had moved mechanically, removing the framed photos, her daughter's college graduation, a picture of her and Dr. Patterson after they'd successfully brought back a patient everyone thought was gone, a snapshot from the hospital's 10-year service awards dinner where she'd been honored in front of the entire staff. She put these items in a cardboard box that Linda had provided. How convenient. They'd prepared a box for her before telling her she was fired. Walking through the emergency department one last time was surreal. Her colleagues were at their stations, working, focused on patients. Some caught her eye and immediately looked away, confused. Others didn't notice her at all. This was her kingdom, the place where she'd become herself, where she discovered that she was capable of extraordinary things. She'd trained half these nurses. She'd created protocols that had made this department one of the safest in the state. She'd mentored residents, helped deliver bobbies, held dying patients' hands, and guided families through the worst days of their lives. And now she was walking out, a cardboard box in her arms, a termination letter in her pocket, no longer needed. The parking lot had never looked more desolate. The sun was still shining, cars still came and went, people still moved about their days. The world hadn't stopped. The hospital would continue operating, but Sarah's world had fundamentally shifted on its axis. She stood by her car for a long moment, unable to move, unable to think. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her chest. 16 years. 16 years of dedication, sacrifice, showing up, being the best at what she did. And in a single 30-minute meeting, it had all been reduced to redundant. She didn't get in her car. Instead, she started walking. She needed time to process this betrayal, this shock, this sudden violent interruption of the life she'd built. The hospital disappeared behind her as she walked, one foot in front of the other, carrying her termination papers toward a future she couldn't see. The 2-mile walk home seemed fitting. She needed the distance. She needed time. She needed to understand how the world could change so completely, so quickly, so unfairly. She had no idea that the world was about to change again, in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The industrial district of the city was not the scenic route home, but it was the route Sarah chose anyway. She couldn't face the main roads where colleagues might see her, might recognize her walking in her scrubs with a cardboard box clutched against her chest like a security blanket. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was hiding. Sarah Mitchell, who'd spent her entire career helping others, was now hiding like a criminal fleeing a crime scene. Her work shoes, white leather with reinforced arch support, the same brand she'd worn for every shift for the last 8 years, rubbed mercilessly against her heels. She'd walked in these shoes for thousands of miles through hospital corridors, but she'd never walked this route before, and the blisters were forming almost immediately. Each step sent a small jolt of pain up her legs, but the physical pain was almost welcome. It gave her something concrete to focus on besides the chaos in her mind. The October wind picked up, carrying the smell of distant rain and industrial exhaust. The trees lining the sidewalk were beginning their transition to autumn, leaves shifting from green to gold and rust. Under any other circumstances, Sarah would have appreciated the beauty. She loved fall. She loved the way the world seemed to be preparing for rest and renewal. But today, the changing season felt like a mockery. Everything was changing, and none of it was good. Her phone had started buzzing almost immediately after she left the hospital. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails. The hospital grapevine had activated at lightning speed. In an organization of over 500 employees, news traveled faster than email. By 2:47 p.m., people already knew. Sarah had trained most of the department. They'd worked hundreds of 12-hour shifts together, had celebrated births and mourned deaths, had held each other up during impossible nights when 4 patients were coding simultaneously and there weren't enough hands. She read the messages without stopping walking. OMG, are you serious? I just heard this is insane. Marcus. Sarah, I'm so sorry. This is corporate BS. Jennifer. You can't be fired. You're the best nurse this hospital has. Dr. Patterson. We need to fight this. Let me connect you with an employment lawyer. Michael. Sarah didn't respond to any of them. What could she say? The words seemed impossible to form. The termination papers in her cardboard box weren't a mistake. They were final, signed, processed. She was now officially unemployed, effective immediately, with health insurance that would expire in 30 days. 30 days. She did the math automatically. Her training in logistics and resource management couldn't be turned off even in crisis mode. 30 days until she had no health insurance. She was 53 years old with a history of high blood pressure. Her daughter was in her second year of college, and while she'd gotten a scholarship, Sarah had been covering the remaining tuition. Her mortgage had 15 years left on it. She had a car payment. She had a credit card with a balance she'd been paying down consistently. All of it was built on a salary that no longer existed. By the time she reached mile 1, the emotional dam had broken. Sarah found herself crying openly, not bothering to wipe the tears away. An older gentleman walking in the opposite direction gave her a concerned look and asked if she was okay. She nodded, unable to speak. Of course she wasn't okay. Her entire life had just been dismantled in 30 minutes. She thought about the mistakes she could have made. Had she been too good at her job? Had she intimidated the new administration? She knew she was respected, maybe even feared in some ways. She made decisions quickly, acted with authority, didn't second-guess herself. Maybe that threatened someone like Richard Briggs, a man who seemed uncomfortable with any authority he didn't directly control. But that was insane reasoning. You didn't fire someone for being competent. At mile 1.3, Sarah found herself walking past a coffee shop. Through the window, she could see people sitting at small tables, some working on laptops, some chatting with friends. Their lives looked normal, uncomplicated. She wondered what it felt like to have a bad day that didn't involve losing your entire career. She thought about the patients she wouldn't be seeing. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman with the chronic pain condition who specifically requested Sarah to administer her medication because she was the only one who could do it without causing additional discomfort. The teenage boy with anxiety who would only let Sarah take his blood pressure. The young mother who'd been coming to the emergency department due to complications with her pregnancy and had insisted that Sarah be present for all her visits. What would happen to them? Would some temp nurse from an outsourced staffing agency know their histories, know their fears? Would anyone care the way Sarah cared? The thought made her stop walking for a moment. She set down the cardboard box on the sidewalk and leaned against a fence, her chest heaving. This wasn't just about losing a job. This was about losing her purpose. For 16 years, Sarah had known exactly why she existed. She existed to take care of people. She existed to save lives. She existed to be the calm in the storm, the expert in the chaos, the person people could trust when everything was falling apart. Now she was just a middle-aged woman with outdated skills and no employer. The self-pity threatened to consume her entirely, so Sarah picked up her box and kept walking. Dwelling on what she'd lost wasn't productive. She needed to think practically. First, she'd call an employment lawyer. Michael's offer was good. Maybe there was something illegal about this. Maybe she could fight it, but in her heart she knew the truth. Corporate could do this. They'd probably done it before. They'd do it again. The law protected workers, but loopholes were designed for situations exactly like this. Second, she needed to update her resume. She needed to start looking for jobs. At 53, with a 16-year gap in employment diversity, she'd be starting from scratch. Maybe she could find work at another hospital. Maybe she could work in urgent care clinics. Maybe she'd have to take a position with less pay and less prestige. All the things she'd worked for, all the authority she'd earned, it could all disappear. Her daughter, God, she had to tell her daughter. Sarah had been saving for her education, had sacrificed vacations and nice clothes and a social life to ensure her child wouldn't have to take out loans. How would she explain that the safety net she'd tried to build had disintegrated? By mile 1.8, her feet were screaming, the blisters had burst, and her emotional reserves were completely depleted. She felt numb, hollowed out, like a building that had been gutted of everything that made it functional. The September sun was beginning to set, casting everything in shades of orange and purple. She was almost home, almost to the small house she'd bought after her divorce, the house she'd renovated room by room, the house that represented her independence and her success. Soon she'd be sitting alone in that house, with her termination papers and her cardboard box, trying to figure out how to survive. She had no idea that by tomorrow morning, that cardboard box would seem insignificant. She had no idea that the universe was about to intervene in the most dramatic, impossible way. She had no idea that her story wasn't ending. It was about to reach a turning point that would change everything. For now, she just kept walking, one painful step at a time, toward an uncertain future. The interstate bridge that crossed the Millbrook River was a straight stretch of highway that most drivers paid no attention to. They drove across it, sometimes noticing the water below, sometimes not. It was just a bridge on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday afternoon. But at 3:47 p.m., the bridge became the epicenter of a disaster that would change the lives of everyone involved. The charter bus had been carrying 43 teenagers from the Columbus North High School marching band, along with 8 adult chaperones, teachers, parents, and the band director. They were returning home after a regional competition in which they'd placed second. The teenagers were euphoric despite the loss. They were singing, laughing, playing games in the seats, making plans for the evening. The atmosphere on the bus was electric with the kind of joy that only teenagers could generate. Loud, unself-conscious, infectious. The driver, Marcus Webb, was a professional with 15 years of experience. He'd driven charter buses across half the country. He knew the routes, knew the roads, knew the risks. He was careful, attentive, and confident. As he approached the bridge on I-80, he was maintaining the speed limit of 65 miles per hour, one hand on the wheel, the other holding a lukewarm cup of coffee from a gas station stopped an hour earlier. He never saw the delivery truck until it was too late. The truck, a large box truck operated by a regional delivery company, had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure on the bridge. The steering had locked. The driver, a young man named Derek Thompson, had been fighting with the wheel for the last 50 yards, trying desperately to correct course, but the vehicle had a mind of its own. It had drifted across the center line into the opposite lanes, directly into the path of the charter bus. Marcus reacted with the instinct of an experienced driver. He swerved hard to the right, trying to avoid the collision. But physics was unforgiving. A fully loaded charter bus carrying over 12,000 pounds cannot change direction as quickly as the human mind commands. The impact occurred at approximately 58 miles per hour, with the left front corner of the bus colliding with the broadside of the delivery truck. The sound was indescribable, a metallic scream that seemed to tear reality itself apart. The bus crumpled like paper, its reinforced frame no match for the kinetic energy involved. Seats ripped from their bolts. The windshield exploded into thousands of fragments. The roof buckled inward. 23 teenagers and 6 adults were thrown violently through the interior of the bus, bodies colliding with metal and plastic and each other. A girl named Emily Chen, who'd been singing in the back row, suddenly found herself upside down on the ceiling of the bus, her arm bent at an angle it wasn't supposed to bend. A boy named Jason Rodriguez was pinned under a collapsed seat, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. Another teenager, Marcus Washington, had a piece of sharp metal embedded in his leg. The pain was so intense and so immediate that he couldn't even scream. His body was in shock. The truck driver was killed instantly. The trauma to his vehicle and his body was simply too severe for survival. The emergency calls came within 90 seconds. Witnesses who'd been driving behind the bus had pulled over immediately and dialed 911. Their voices were panicked, their descriptions chaotic. "There's been an accident on the bridge. A bus. A big bus. There are people everywhere. Oh my God, there's blood everywhere." The 911 dispatcher, a woman named Patricia, had been working emergency dispatch for 12 years, but her voice still shook as she received the initial report. She immediately began the cascade protocol for mass casualty incidents. She alerted every ambulance in the region. She called the hospital. She contacted state police. She did everything by the book, her training overriding her emotional response to the magnitude of the disaster. At Riverside Medical Center, the call came through at 3:51 p.m. The trauma center's charge nurse, a woman named Dr. Susan Martinez, received the communication. "We have a mass casualty accident on Interstate 80 bridge crossing. Charter bus struck by delivery truck. At least 40 victims reported. Multiple trauma levels from minor to critical. ETA to hospital, 10 to 15 minutes for the first transports." Dr. Martinez felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders. 40 victims. This wasn't a typical afternoon. This was the kind of disaster that tested every system, every protocol, every person in the hospital. She immediately began mobilizing. She activated the Emergency Operations Center. She paged all available trauma surgeons. She notified the blood bank. She cleared the emergency department of routine patients. The entire hospital, in less than 5 minutes, had transformed from normal operations into disaster mode. In his office on the second floor, Administrator Richard Briggs was reviewing budget reports when his phone rang. It was his assistant. "Sir, we've received notification of a mass casualty incident on I-80. Approximately 40 victims. Hospital is going into full emergency protocol." Briggs felt his stomach drop. 40 victims. That was a major event. That required coordination, expertise, institutional knowledge. That required the best people operating at peak efficiency. And that's when the realization hit him, with the force of a physical blow. He scrolled through his calendar on his computer. 2:00 p.m. terminated Sarah Mitchell. 2:47 p.m. effective immediately. 3:47 p.m. mass casualty accident. 3:51 p.m. hospital receives notification. Sarah Mitchell had walked out the door exactly 1 hour and 4 minutes before this disaster occurred. Briggs felt his hands begin to shake. He pulled up the personnel files on his computer. Who was running the emergency department response right now? Linda Chen, the current charge nurse. She was competent, but she'd only been in the position for 6 months. She'd never managed a mass casualty incident. She'd never coordinated the complex logistics of receiving and triaging 40 victims simultaneously. Sarah Mitchell had managed the last mass casualty event 5 years ago, a chemical plant explosion that had sent 37 victims to the hospital. She'd orchestrated the entire operation with a precision that had impressed everyone involved. The trauma surgeons had talked about it for years. "That was textbook perfect," Dr. Patterson had said. "I've never seen coordination that smooth." Briggs pulled up his sent email folder and found the termination notice he'd sent to HR exactly 2 hours and 59 minutes ago. The timing felt surreal, like cosmic cruel irony. He'd fired her for being redundant. He'd reduced her 16 years of service to a line item in a budget optimization spreadsheet. And now, as the first ambulance was racing toward his hospital with a critically injured teenager inside, as the emergency department was chaos, as his staff was drowning in an impossible situation, Briggs understood with crystal clarity what redundancy actually meant. It meant he'd fired the one person who couldn't be replaced. He stood up from his desk on trembling legs and made a decision that would change everything. He reached for his phone and dialed Dr. Patterson's cell number. There was only one solution to this problem. There was only one person who could save this situation. The question was, would she come? Sarah was exactly 1.7 miles from her house when her phone rang. She'd counted the distance mentally, mapping out the remaining painful walk, when the vibration against her hip made her stop walking. She pulled the phone from her pocket without checking the caller ID. It was probably her daughter, or maybe her ex-husband, or one of the many people who'd already texted. She was prepared to send it to voicemail. She couldn't talk to anyone right now. She didn't have the emotional capacity for conversations. But the voice on the other end cut through her defenses with the force of a trauma call. Sarah, Sarah, thank God I reached you. Don't hang up, please don't hang up. It was Dr. James Patterson. His voice was different from anything she'd ever heard from him before. In all her years working alongside him, through the most intense emergencies, through code blues and hemorrhages and impossible surgical decisions, she'd never heard fear in his voice. But it was there now, raw, undeniable, desperate. Dr. Patterson, Sarah said. She found herself automatically shifting into her professional mode despite the cardboard box still clutched in her other arm. What's wrong? Are you hurt? No, I'm not hurt, but Sarah, listen to me very carefully. There's been a mass casualty accident on I-80. A charter bus carrying teenagers collided with a delivery truck. We're getting reports of 43 to 50 victims. The first ambulances are arriving at the hospital right now. Sarah, I need you to understand the scope of this. I need you to understand that we're drowning. Sarah felt her breath catch. 43 victims. Teenagers. She could picture it instantly. The chaos, the triage, the impossible decisions about who to treat first, the coordination required to manage something of that magnitude. Her mind automatically began running through protocols, thinking about resource allocation, about the systems that would need to be activated. Dr. Patterson, I was just fired this afternoon. I'm not. I know, he interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of that knowledge and also the desperate dismissal of it. I'm looking at your termination order right now on my desk. Richard Briggs sent it to me by mistake in a mass email notification. But Sarah, I don't care about that right now. I care about the fact that I have 43 traumatized teenagers being brought into my emergency department, and the nursing staff we have right now doesn't know how to manage a response at this scale. Sarah's stomach clenched. She knew he was right. Linda Chen was a good nurse, but she'd only been in charge of the night shift for 6 months. She'd never managed a mass casualty incident. None of the newer nurses had. The institutional knowledge, the experience, the ability to see chaos and immediately know how to organize it, that was Sarah's domain. That was what 16 years had given her. Linda is panicking, Dr. Patterson continued, his voice slightly muffled as if he was looking away from the phone to address someone else. The residents are making mistakes. The triage tent is disorganized. Sarah, people are going to die if we don't get better coordination right now. And I know what I'm asking you. I know it's unfair, but I'm asking you anyway. Sarah was walking again without realizing it, her feet moving in the direction of the hospital even though she didn't have transportation. I don't have a car here, doctor. I'm in the industrial district, 2 miles from the hospital. I was walking home. I can call an Uber. No time, he said immediately. An Uber will take 10 minutes minimum. We need you now. Right now. Sarah, I'm authorizing hospital resources. Briggs is mobilizing whatever we need. How far are you from Riverside Drive? About 3 blocks, Sarah said, mentally calculating. Why? Keep walking toward Riverside Drive. Head for the open area near the old manufacturing plant. The hospital is dispatching our air ambulance helicopters to pick you up. 2 helicopters, Sarah. That's how serious this is. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. You're sending helicopters to get me. I'm sending everything we have, Dr. Patterson said, and his voice cracked slightly. Sarah, I wouldn't ask this if I didn't believe that your presence could save lives. And I do believe that. I believe that absolutely. So yes, we're sending helicopters. There was a moment of silence. Sarah stood on the sidewalk of a street she didn't recognize, holding a cardboard box containing her entire career, talking to the man who'd mentored her through some of the darkest days of her professional life. Part of her wanted to refuse. Part of her wanted to say, "I don't work there anymore. I was fired. This isn't my responsibility." Part of her wanted to nurse her wound, to embrace her anger, to let them suffer the consequences of their corporate stupidity. But she'd never been that kind of person. "What's the acuity?" she asked, her professional mind already organizing information. "How many critical? How many surgical candidates?" "We don't have complete triage yet, but early reports suggest at least 12 critical, maybe 18 if we include urgent. The trauma surgeons are already scrubbing in. Sarah, we need you in the emergency department. We need your eyes. We need your judgment. We need you to tell us what we're missing." She thought about Mrs. Chen, the elderly patient who specifically requested her. She thought about the teenage boy with anxiety who would only let her take his blood pressure. She thought about the fact that she'd spent 16 years learning how to save lives in exactly these kinds of situations. Her anger, her pain, her justifiable sense of betrayal, all of it mattered far less than the fact that teenagers were bleeding right now. "I'm moving toward Riverside Drive," Sarah said. "How many minutes?" "5," Dr. Patterson said with relief flooding his voice. "Maybe 6. They're already lifting off. Sarah, I want you to know." "Don't," she interrupted gently. "We'll talk after. Right now, just focus on getting everyone ready to receive me. I'm going to need a complete status report the second I arrive. I'm going to need to know exactly what resources we have available, who's on which surgical team, and what the incoming queue looks like." "Already preparing it," Dr. Patterson said. Sarah dropped her cardboard box on the sidewalk. Her termination papers, her 16 years, her firing, it could all wait. She started moving faster, pushing through the pain in her blistered feet, her mind already shifting into overdrive. She was calculating mentally, already thinking about coordination, about the critical first hour of a mass casualty response, about the decisions that would need to be made. Above the city, 2 helicopters were changing course, their pilots receiving new coordinates. On the ground at Riverside Medical Center, the chaos was beginning, and Sarah Mitchell, who an hour ago had been redundant, was becoming absolutely essential. She heard the sound before she saw anything. The distant whump-whump-whump of helicopter rotors, growing closer, becoming louder. She was standing in an open area near the old manufacturing plant, the cardboard box containing her old life left abandoned on a sidewalk behind her. She was ready to save lives. She was ready to prove her worth. She was ready to be exactly what she'd always been. Irreplaceable. The helicopters descended toward her position, their rotors cutting through the October air, their pilots searching for the nurse who'd just been fired and now been resurrected by circumstance and necessity. Sarah stood with her arms at her sides, looking up at the sky, waiting for the universe to prove that her firing had been a terrible, terrible mistake. The sound arrived before the helicopters themselves. A low, rhythmic thumping in the distance that grew progressively louder, more insistent, more real. Sarah heard it first and looked up at the sky, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her. But the sound was unmistakable, the distinctive whump-whump-whump of helicopter rotors cutting through the October air. She shielded her eyes from the late afternoon sun, scanning the sky. There, 2 dark silhouettes approaching from the west, their bodies growing larger, more defined as they drew closer. The helicopters banked in unison, their pilots clearly executing a coordinated maneuver, searching for something, searching for her. Sarah felt her chest tighten. This was real. This wasn't a figure of speech or a metaphorical rescue. The hospital had actually sent 2 helicopters to pick her up from a parking lot in the industrial district because she was needed more urgently than any protocol or corporate hierarchy could accommodate. The absurdity and the honor of it crashed over her simultaneously. The first helicopter descended rapidly, angling toward her position. The sound intensified, becoming almost deafening, a physical force that seemed to push against her from all directions. The wind from the rotors picked up, scattering dust and loose debris across the empty lot. Sarah's hair whipped around her face. Loose papers from somewhere, maybe from someone's trash can, swirled through the air like confetti. A plastic bag tumbled past her, caught in the vortex. She could see the helicopter clearly now. It was a medical transport bird, painted white and red with the Riverside Medical Center logo visible on its side. The door on the side was already open, and she could see a paramedic in the doorway, gesturing. The second helicopter was circling above, presumably backup or ready to assist if the first one had mechanical issues. The lead helicopter touched down with surprising grace, settling onto the concrete like a predatory bird coming to rest. The noise was overwhelming, the rotors still spinning, the engine whining, the wind continuing to howl. Sarah could barely think, barely process what was happening. This was insane. This was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not in real life. Not to her. A ground crew member suddenly appeared at her left, moving low to avoid the still spinning rotors. He was shouting something, but his words were lost in the roar of the helicopter's engines. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the open door. Behind him, another crew member emerged, then a third. They were all moving with purpose, with urgency, treating this like the medical emergency it was. Sarah Mitchell, the first crew member, shouted directly into her face, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Are you Sarah Mitchell?" "Yes," she shouted back, not even questioning how they knew her name. "We're looking for Nurse Mitchell. The hospital sent us." He was already moving, pulling her closer to the helicopter. "Move with us, stay low, watch the rotors." They approached the hovering aircraft, and Sarah could see the paramedic in the doorway more clearly now. It was Marcus, one of the flight paramedics she'd worked with dozens of times. His face registered recognition and what looked like profound relief. He was extending his hand, ready to pull her aboard. Sarah ran those last few feet, staying low as instructed, feeling the full force of the rotor wash now. It was like running into a wall made of wind. Her clothes snapped and flapped against her body. Dust got in her eyes, her nose, her mouth. The noise was overwhelming, all-consuming. There was nothing in the world except this moment, this helicopter, this impossible rescue. Marcus grabbed her arm with surprising strength and hauled her up into the helicopter. Hands from inside helped pull her the rest of the way. She tumbled into the aircraft, falling to the floor, gasping. The door slammed shut behind her immediately, and suddenly the noise dropped to something more manageable, still loud, still the constant whump-whump-whump of the rotors, but no longer a physical assault. "Sarah," Marcus was right there, helping her to her feet. "Jesus, am I glad to see you. Buckle in, we need to move." Sarah found herself in a seat, and someone, she wasn't sure who, was clicking safety restraints around her. Everything felt dreamlike, unreal, like she was watching someone else's rescue instead of experiencing her own. The helicopter tilted slightly as the pilot adjusted the controls, and then they were lifting off. The ground disappeared beneath them, and the city spread out below in the amber glow of the late afternoon sun. She looked out the window and could see the parking lot where she'd been standing mere minutes ago. Could see the cardboard box she'd abandoned, looking impossibly small from this height. Could see the industrial district spreading out in all directions, the highways with their traffic, the rivers cutting through the landscape, the buildings of the city proper in the distance. And then the hospital came into view, Riverside Medical Center, the place where she'd spent the last 16 years of her life, the place that had just fired her, the place that had just sent helicopters to rescue her. The pilot's voice came through a speaker somewhere in the aircraft. 10 minutes to Riverside Medical Center. Trauma team is standing by on the helipad. Sarah realized she was trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline, the surreal nature of what was happening. She was in a helicopter. She was being transported to a hospital that had fired her 6 hours ago. She was about to walk into chaos that would require everything she had, everything she'd learned, everything she'd sacrificed over 16 years. Marcus was already preparing supplies, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He looked at her with concern. "You okay? Are you hurt? Does the hospital need us to divert to another facility?" "I'm fine," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just shocked." "Dr. Patterson called this in personally," Marcus said. "He said it was a matter of life and death. He said you were the only person who could manage the situation they're dealing with. That's why we came for you. That's why the pilot agreed to pull you from a parking lot instead of a designated pickup zone." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't about her firing. This wasn't about corporate politics or budget optimization or cost analysis. This was about the fact that in a moment of genuine crisis, the people who mattered most, the people she'd trained, the doctors she'd worked alongside, the institution itself, had recognized that some people cannot be replaced. The helicopter banked slightly, and she could see the road network below, the traffic patterns, the shape of the city she'd lived in her entire adult life. Somewhere down there, teenagers were being brought to the hospital in ambulances. Families were receiving the worst phone calls of their lives. Surgeons were preparing operating rooms. Nurses were mobilizing equipment. And she was descending from the sky to take command of the chaos. The hospital helipad appeared below them, surrounded by emergency personnel. She could see doctors and nurses and paramedics standing ready, waiting for her arrival. The helicopter descended smoothly, hovering for a moment before settling onto the concrete pad. "Here we go," Marcus said. "Let's save some lives." The door opened and Sarah Mitchell, fired nurse, unemployed, devastated, climbed out of a helicopter and walked toward her purpose. The helipad doors burst open the moment the helicopter touched down. Sarah wasn't even fully unbuckled before the medical personnel were moving, their faces showing a mixture of urgency and something else. Was it desperation? Relief? Recognition? She didn't have time to process their expressions. She was moving, stumbling slightly from the residual vibration of the helicopter, her legs unsteady from the flight. A trauma nurse she recognized, Jennifer, who'd worked under her supervision for 2 years, grabbed her arm. "Sarah, oh thank God, you need to change, we have scrubs ready, the department is." Jennifer's voice cracked with emotion. "Sarah, it's chaos, it's absolute chaos in there." They were already moving through the helipad access corridor. Somewhere behind her, the helicopter rotors were winding down, the sound diminishing to a manageable level. But ahead of her, through the doors, was a different kind of noise, the sound of organized emergency, which was never truly organized and never silent. A surgical tech thrust a set of fresh scrubs at her as they walked. "Size 6, right? I grabbed these from your locker." Sarah changed as she walked, her muscle memory taking over her body's functions while her mind assessed the situation. They were moving through corridors she knew like her own home. The walls, the tile, the fluorescent lights, all exactly as she'd left them 6 hours ago. But the atmosphere had changed completely. The hospital had transformed into something different, something more primal, something that demanded absolute focus and total competence. They burst through the doors into the emergency department, and Sarah's breath caught. Controlled chaos. That was the only way to describe it. There were patients everywhere, on gurneys in waiting areas, being triaged in the triage tent they'd set up in the parking lot. Nurses were running between stations. Doctors were barking orders. The monitors were beeping their discordant songs. The smell was different: blood, antiseptic, fear, adrenaline, all mixed together in the recycled hospital air. And they all looked lost. Linda Chen, the charge nurse, was standing in the center of the department looking like a captain of a ship that was going down. She was trying to coordinate at least 5 different incoming patients, 2 teams of surgeons demanding blood supplies, a waiting room full of frantic families, and a pharmacy that was running behind. When she saw Sarah, her face registered first shock, then a wave of relief so profound that she actually looked like she might cry. Sarah, Linda said, her voice wavering slightly. Thank God, I don't. We have 18 critical patients, 12 moderate injuries, and the rest minor trauma. We've already transported 6 to OR. Blood supplies are holding, but barely. I don't know how we're going to. Step aside, Sarah said quietly. She didn't say it harshly. She didn't say it with anger or recrimination. She said it as a statement of fact, as a woman who was simply taking the helm from someone who'd been overwhelmed. Linda moved without argument, almost gratefully stepping back from the overwhelming responsibility. Sarah's eyes swept the emergency department in a single comprehensive assessment. She saw everything at once: the inventory of supplies, the availability of staff, the medical acuity of incoming patients, the bottlenecks in the system, the areas where mistakes were already beginning to form. Her mind processed it all instantly, with the kind of intuitive understanding that came from 16 years of doing this in every possible variation. Listen to me, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chaos without needing to shout. Everyone turned toward her. I know you're scared. I know this is overwhelming. I know some of you don't know who I am, but I've done this before. I've managed emergencies that would make this look simple. And I'm telling you right now, we are going to save every single person we can, and we're going to do it systematically. She pointed to a resident who looked completely lost. You, surgical resident, what's your name? David, the young man said nervously. David, I need you to take over the triage tent. You're going to review every patient, you're going to assign them a priority level, and you're going to communicate those priority levels to this station every 30 seconds. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. Jennifer, Sarah said, turning to the nurse who'd guided her here. I'm promoting you to assist me. Your job is to be my eyes and ears. You watch the entire department and you tell me immediately if anything starts to fall apart. Understood? Understood. Sarah moved to the central station and pulled up the patient database. She could see the incoming ambulances, the hospital protocols, the resource availability. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with authority, her eyes scanning information with the intensity of someone reading survival instructions in a plane about to crash. We have 6 units of O-negative blood available. I'm implementing a rationing protocol. Jennifer, communicate this to the surgeons. Critical traumas only use O-negative until we can type and cross the others. Everyone else gets whatever positive blood type matches their tests. We have 2 operating rooms available. I'm prioritizing the 2 most critical traumas. The others will go to surgery on a first-come, first-served basis as rooms open up. She turned to face the entire emergency department. Nobody panic. Nobody makes a decision without checking with this station first. We coordinate everything. We communicate everything. We trust each other. And we save lives. That's what we do here. The energy in the department shifted. It was like she'd thrown a switch. The fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into focused purpose. Nurses moved with more direction. Doctors stopped second-guessing themselves. The chaos became organized. The panic became protocol. Dr. Patterson appeared at the edge of her vision. He was standing in the doorway of one of the trauma bays, and when their eyes met, he nodded slightly. Not gratefully, not apologetically, just a professional acknowledgement of a fellow expert showing up exactly when needed. Sarah moved through the department like a conductor leading an orchestra. She caught a young nurse about to administer the wrong medication and redirected him with kindness, not condescension. She reorganized the supply station so that critical supplies were immediately accessible. She made real-time decisions about which patients needed immediate imaging, which could wait, which needed blood products, which needed specialty consultations. One of the incoming patients was a teenage girl, maybe 16, who was conscious but terrified. As they wheeled her past Sarah's station, their eyes met. The girl's face showed absolute panic. Sarah left her station, which broke protocol, but some things were more important than protocol. She walked alongside the gurney and took the girl's hand. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Emily," the girl stammered. "Emily, my name is Sarah. I'm the head nurse here, and I want you to know something. You're in the best hospital in the state. You're surrounded by the best doctors and nurses you could possibly have, and I'm going to personally make sure you get exactly what you need. Do you understand?" Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face, but her breathing had slowed. Her panic had reduced to manageable fear. Sarah squeezed her hand once and returned to her station. By the time night fell, the emergency department was still chaotic, still intense, still demanding every ounce of skill and knowledge everyone possessed. But it was no longer drowning. It was handling the crisis. It was saving lives. And at the center of it all, the nurse who'd been fired that morning was orchestrating a masterpiece of emergency medicine. The first 12 hours blended into an endless cascade of decisions, interventions, and critical moments. Sarah didn't sit down. She barely drank water. She moved through the emergency department and the adjacent surgical units like a ghost, materializing wherever she was needed most, solving problems before they became catastrophes. At 6:15 p.m., a young resident was about to administer morphine to a patient who'd coded earlier that day, a patient who'd had an adverse reaction to narcotics documented in his chart. Sarah caught the resident's hand before it touched the IV port. "Stop," she said quietly. "Check his allergy profile." The resident looked confused. "He's in pain. And he'll go into anaphylaxis if you give him that morphine," Sarah said gently, but with absolute certainty. "He had a documented reaction 3 years ago. I remember because his mother told me about it when he was admitted with a different complaint. Alternative is fentanyl. It's in the drawer to your right." The resident's eyes widened as he checked the chart. There it was, buried in the admission notes. Sarah had potentially saved this patient's life by remembering a detail from a chart review 3 years ago. By 8:30 p.m., Sarah was coordinating between 3 operating rooms, each demanding blood products, each needing updates on surgical priorities. Dr. Patterson was in OR1 working on a teenager with massive abdominal trauma. The attending trauma surgeon was in OR2 working on a girl with a fractured femur that had nicked an artery. A vascular surgeon borrowed from the cardiovascular unit was in OR3 trying to save a boy's crushed leg. Sarah tracked every unit of blood, every surgical supply, every piece of equipment. She had a whiteboard in front of her with each patient's name, injury, surgical status, and blood type. It looked like a military command center for a single hospital unit, and it was working. "O positive, 2 units for OR2, she called out to the blood bank tech. "We're getting close to the ceiling on that patient. Tell the surgeon he has 2 units maximum before we need to switch to uncrossed O negative or delay and wait for type and cross." The tech nodded and was already moving. At 10:45 p.m., Sarah was in the recovery area when a patient, Marcus Washington, the boy with the crushed leg, started seizing. His post-operative status was suddenly critical. Sarah was there immediately, her hands moving with precision that came from thousands of hours of managing exactly this kind of emergency. "Get me lorazepam 2 milligrams IV push," she ordered. "Suction his airway. I need a continuous monitor. Someone get Dr. Patterson. He's finishing the last patient. Tell him we have a post-op seizure in recovery bay 3. The seizure lasted 43 seconds. It felt like an eternity. Nurses moved around her in synchronized motion, each understanding their role without explicit instruction. Sarah maintained the patient's airway, monitored his oxygen saturation, stayed calm even as adrenaline was flooding her own system. The lorazepam worked, the seizure stopped, the patient's vital signs stabilized. "Good work," Sarah said to the recovery nurses. "He's going back to ICU for monitoring. I want someone checking on him every 15 minutes. Call me immediately if anything changes." She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She was already moving, already thinking about the next patient, the next crisis. By midnight, Sarah had been awake for 18 hours. She'd been in continuous crisis mode for 9. Most people would have collapsed. Sarah was running on a substance that had no name, a combination of adrenaline, purpose, muscle memory, and the absolute knowledge that people were depending on her. She found herself in the triage tent at 1:00 a.m., checking on the remaining minor injuries. These were the teenagers who'd had the good fortune of being on the less damaged side of the bus. Broken arms, lacerations, concussions. Serious enough to need medical attention. Not serious enough to dominate the resources being devoted to the critical cases. One girl, maybe 15, was sitting on a gurney with her arm in a temporary splint. Her name was Sophie, according to her chart. She was crying quietly, probably from pain but definitely from emotional trauma. Sarah sat down next to her, the first time she'd sat down all night. "Sophie, I'm Sarah. I'm one of the nurses here. How are you feeling?" "My arm hurts," Sophie said, her voice small. "And I keep thinking about Jimmy. Did Jimmy make it? He was sitting next to me. I haven't seen him since the accident." Sarah's hand went immediately to her mental patient list. Jimmy Chen, age 17, spleen laceration, transported to OR at 5:30 p.m., currently in recovery. Jimmy's in recovery right now. He made it through surgery. He's stable. You're going to see him tomorrow after he's been moved to his hospital room. I promise. Sophie's face transformed from despair to something resembling hope. He's alive. He's alive, Sarah confirmed. And he's going to be okay. His surgery went well. That's the third teenager who's going to be okay because of what we did today. She didn't mention the losses. There hadn't been any deaths. They'd managed to save all 43 victims. But she didn't mention the close calls, the moments where it had come down to split-second decisions about resource allocation, the patients who'd been centimeters away from death. By 4:00 a.m., the crisis had stabilized into a different phase. The acute emergency was over. Now it was about managing recovery, preventing complications, and coordinating the complex logistics of ensuring all the survivors got appropriate ongoing care. Sarah had transitioned from crisis management to systems management, and her role was shifting from immediate intervention to oversight and coordination. Dr. Patterson found her at 5:30 a.m. sitting in the physician's lounge with a cold cup of coffee that she wasn't drinking. He looked as exhausted as she felt, his surgical mask hanging around his neck, his scrubs soaked with blood and sweat. "You should go home," he said. Sarah looked up at him. "Did we get them all? Everyone who came in? Did we save everyone?" "Everyone who came in alive made it through," Dr. Patterson said. "The truck driver didn't survive the initial impact, but the 43 from the bus, all of them are alive right now. That's a miracle, Sarah. That's because of you." Sarah felt something break inside her chest, but not in a bad way. It was the breaking of tension, of pressure, of the weight of responsibility she'd been carrying for the last 11 hours. She felt tears forming, but she blinked them away. "I need to check on the post-op patients," she said. "No, you don't," Dr. Patterson said gently. "Linda has night shift under control now. You've already done everything humanly possible. It's time to rest." Sarah wanted to argue, but she could barely keep her eyes open. Her body was running on fumes. As she stood up, her legs felt weak, unreliable. The exhaustion crashed over her all at once, the kind of exhaustion that came from pushing far beyond normal human limits. As she walked toward the exit, nurses and residents she'd coordinated all night nodded at her in silent acknowledgement. They understood what she'd done. They understood that their success, the fact that 43 teenagers were alive, that every patient had made it through the crisis, was largely because she'd been there. By 6:00 a.m., as the sun was rising on a new day, Sarah was leaving the hospital. The city was waking up. The news vans were already parked in the hospital parking lot, preparing their morning coverage. Reporters would soon be calling her a hero, though she didn't feel heroic. She felt like someone who'd done her job exactly as it was meant to be done. She felt like someone who'd remembered, after just a few hours away, exactly why she'd spent 16 years doing this. And she felt like someone who was never going to let the hospital forget what she was worth. The news broke like a thunderstorm across local and regional media outlets before the sun had fully risen. The headline was impossible to miss, plastered across every news website, blared from every radio station, scrolled across the bottom of every television screen. Local nurse fired HOURS before disaster, recalled by helicopter, SAVES 43 lives. By 7:00 a.m. there were news vans in the hospital parking lot. By 8:00 a.m. national news networks had picked up the story. By 9:00 a.m. Sarah Mitchell's name was trending on social media. The narrative was too perfect, too dramatic, too redemptive to resist. Woman loses job through corporate greed. Hospital faces worst emergency in years. Same woman is recalled via helicopter and saves everyone. It was the kind of story that made people believe in divine justice, in cosmic comeuppance, in the universe actually caring about fairness. Sarah didn't want to see any of it. She'd gone home, showered for the first time in 24 hours, and collapsed into bed still wearing her hospital scrubs that she'd changed out of. She'd meant to sleep for a few hours. She'd ended up sleeping for 9. She woke to her phone ringing. It was her daughter, Michelle. "Mom, oh my God, Mom, are you okay? I saw the news. They're saying you saved 43 teenagers. They're calling you a hero. Why didn't you tell me? Why did I have to find out from CNN?" Michelle was in her second year at Columbia University, and she'd stumbled across the story while getting coffee at a campus cafe. The barista had recognized her last name and mentioned the news story. Sarah could hear the mixture of pride and concern in her daughter's voice. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice still rough from exhaustion. "I'm sorry I didn't call. I just got home a few hours ago. I've been sleeping." "Mom, this is insane. You're being interviewed everywhere. There's a petition online demanding the hospital rehire you with a raise. People are angry about you being fired." Sarah felt a flutter of something in her chest. Not pleasure exactly, but recognition. The system that had discarded her was being held accountable by the people who used and understood it. She hung up with Michelle after promising to call back later with full details. But before she could even think about resting again, her phone rang again. This time it was the hospital's main line. "Sarah, this is Linda Chen. I'm sorry to call so early, but Administrator Briggs is requesting a meeting with you. He said it's urgent. He said to tell you that. Well, he said to tell you that he owes you an apology and a conversation." Sarah felt a certain grim satisfaction at those words. The hospital's executive conference room was on the third floor, a space Sarah had never been inside. It was all mahogany and glass, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Richard Briggs was standing at the window when she arrived, his tie already loosened despite the early hour. He looked like he hadn't slept. When he turned to face her, his expression was a complicated mixture of contrition, relief, and something that might have been fear. "Sarah," he said immediately, "thank you for coming. I don't know where to start. I made a catastrophic mistake, not just in firing you, but in fundamentally misunderstanding what value means in a hospital system." Sarah sat down without being invited. She was too tired for ceremony. "You fired me because I was more expensive than an outsourced staffing agency." "Yes," Briggs admitted. He sat across from her, his hands on the table looking nervous. "I was implementing a cost optimization strategy that was designed to reduce our operational expenses by 12% over the next 2 years. Your position, combined with several other senior nursing roles, represented significant savings if we outsourced to a third-party staffing company. And yesterday proved why that was a terrible idea." "Yesterday proved that you're irreplaceable," Briggs said quietly. I've spent the last 18 hours reviewing the hospital's response to the mass casualty incident. I've read every report, watched the security footage, interviewed every staff member who was involved. And every single person has the same thing to say. Without you, we would have failed. People would have died. Sarah felt the weight of that acknowledgement settle on her. It was true. She knew it was true, but hearing someone else, especially the person who'd fired her, say it so directly was different. I'm here to offer you a new employment contract, Briggs continued, sliding a document across the mahogany table. Double your previous salary, a signing bonus of $250,000, complete authority over emergency department operations and nursing staff decisions, and a public apology that I will make personally to you and to the entire hospital. Sarah looked at the contract without touching it. The numbers were obscene, more money than she'd ever imagined making. And what about the other nurses, the ones you were going to outsource? Briggs's expression shifted. He hadn't expected that question. What do you mean? I mean that you fired me because I was expensive. But the real plan was to fire a lot of senior nursing staff and replace them with contract workers at lower wages. That plan didn't go away just because you need me right now. So if I'm going to come back, those nurses come back too, with their previous salaries and their jobs protected. Sarah, I'm not sure I have the authority to. Then you don't have a deal, Sarah interrupted. And you'll watch me give interviews to every news outlet explaining how your cost-cutting measures almost resulted in preventable deaths during a mass casualty incident. How you fired the one person who could manage such a crisis. How corporate profit margins almost killed teenagers. Briggs was very quiet for a long moment. Sarah could see him calculating, running through scenarios, trying to figure out the cost-benefit analysis of her demands. Finally, he spoke. I'll rehire the displaced nursing staff. Full salaries, job protections in writing, anything else. One more thing, Sarah said. The outsourcing contract gets canceled, permanently. This hospital invests in its nursing staff instead of trying to replace them with cheaper labor. That's going to cost millions. Yes, Sarah agreed, but it will save lives. Isn't that what a hospital is supposed to do? Briggs signed the amended contract that afternoon. By evening, official announcements were being made. Sarah Mitchell was being rehired. She was being promoted to Director of Emergency Services. 7 other displaced nurses were being brought back. The outsourcing contract was being terminated. The hospital would be investing in internal nursing staff rather than external staffing agencies. The news outlets ate it up. It became a story about corporate accountability, about a woman who'd been wronged standing up not just for herself, but for the entire profession. Twitter exploded with support. Healthcare workers began sharing their own stories of being undervalued and undercompensated. 3 days later, Sarah walked back into Riverside Medical Center not as a fired employee slinking away with a cardboard box, but as the hospital's newest director. The emergency department staff stood and applauded as she entered. Some of them were crying. All of them understood what had just happened, that Sarah had used her moment of validation not just for personal vindication, but to protect all of them. Dr. Patterson was waiting in her new office, the office that had previously been the administrative assistant to the director's space, but was now being completely renovated for her. He handed her a coffee, the expensive kind from the cafe, not the burnt hospital variety. "Welcome back, Director Mitchell," he said with a slight smile. Sarah looked out the window of her new office and could see the spot in the parking lot where she'd been standing when the helicopters descended. It felt like a lifetime ago. It had been less than 72 hours. She thought about the teenagers who were recovering in hospital beds. She thought about the families who'd received the best possible news, that their children had survived. She thought about the 9 other nurses whose jobs had been saved because she'd negotiated in good faith. And she thought about how sometimes the universe had a way of making things right, Not always, not for everyone, but sometimes. She turned back to Dr. Patterson. "Let's build the best emergency department in the country," she said, "starting now." The end.